Hi, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent. Today, I'll cover the Everest climb where an arrogant couple made fun of a Sherpa, not knowing the kind of brutal karma the mountain was about to hand them. They mocked his appearance, his skills, and his experience. But what ended up happening to their entire expedition near the summit, on the highest mountain in the world, was so unbelievably devastating that even I couldn't see it coming. It was May 20th, 2017, and the wind across the south col of Mount Everest was already tearing at the tents pitched at 26,000 feet. The south col is the last camp before the summit, a barren saddle of ice and loose rock sitting right at the edge of what climbers call the death zone, the altitude above 26,000 feet, where there is so little oxygen that the human body is quite literally dying the whole time it is up there. Nothing heals at that height, nothing recovers, and every hour spent that high is borrowed against a clock that only ever resets by going down. Above the col stands the final 3,000 feet of the mountain, a steep ramp of snow and ice and rock that climbers move up through the night so they can reach the top in the morning and, if everything goes right, be back down before the afternoon weather rolls in. Almost nobody up there is climbing without bottled oxygen, and almost nobody is climbing without the Sherpa teams who fix the ropes, carry the loads, manage the gas, and quietly make the whole thing survivable for paying clients who could never do it alone. Tate and Sloan Whitlock had paid a great deal of money to be standing on that col. They were 43 and 41 from Scottsdale, Arizona, a married couple who had built a comfortable, photogenic life and a real following around it. He had made his money in medical device sales and carried himself like a man who had never lost an argument he could afford to win. She ran their lifestyle brand, the trips, the gear, the carefully lit mornings, and had turned the two of them into the kind of couple other people screenshot and envy. Everest was supposed to be the crown on all of it, the highest, the hardest, the one that would make every other post they had ever made look small. The thing you have to understand about them is that they did not see this climb the way a real mountaineer sees it, as something earned slowly over years of smaller peaks and a whole lot of humility. They saw it as a thing they had purchased, like a first-class seat or a table that should have been ready and waiting the moment they walked in. And in their world, when you pay enough for something, the people around it exist to make it go smoothly, not to ever tell you no. I've watched people treat a summit like a product they ordered online, and it never once goes the way they think it will. They had been collecting summits for a few years, the way certain people collect them, with heavy guiding and fixed ropes and a team of professionals doing the genuinely dangerous work, while the client simply walks the route between them. There's nothing wrong with that on its own. Plenty of good, humble people climb exactly that way and treat the staff around them like the experts they are. The Whitlocks did not. They had shown up at base camp already, certain they knew enough, complaining about the food, complaining about the pace of the acclimatization rotations, and sitting through the safety briefings like people enduring a fire drill rather than absorbing information that might one day keep them alive. The hardest thing for a certain kind of wealthy client to accept about a mountain like this is that it is the one room they will ever walk into where their money buys them almost nothing that matters. It can buy the permit, the tents, the oxygen, and the finest guides on Earth. It cannot buy a body that has acclimatized. It cannot buy the judgment that comes from years of smaller climbs. And it absolutely cannot buy the humility to do what a more experienced person tells you when your own life is on the line. Everything the Whitlocks had ever used to get everything they wanted was useless above 26,000 feet, and they had no idea because nothing in their lives had ever once required them to find out. I want to be careful. Plenty of paying clients are humble and kind, but these two had decided the mountain owed them a summit. The man assigned to lead them to the top was named Pemba Rinzin. He was 39, born in a village in the Khumbu Valley, in the shadow of the same peaks he now climbed for a living, and he had stood on the summit of Everest 11 separate times. He had been turned back by weather. He had carried sick climbers down on his own back. He had watched people die up high, and he had a quiet, exact way of reading the mountain and the sky that came from a lifetime of paying very close attention to both. By any honest measure, he was one of the most qualified human beings on the entire mountain that season. Pemba did not climb for the glory of it, the way the clients often imagined. He climbed because it was the best work available to a man from his valley, work that paid for his daughter's schooling down in Kathmandu, and kept the roof on his parents' house in the Khumbu, and he was very good at it. Good in the patient, unshowy way of a person whose entire job is to bring other people home alive. He had a wife and 2 girls who watched the weather reports during the climbing season, the way the families of fishermen watch the sea. Everything careful about him, every slow step and rationed breath and nervous glance at the sky came from the simple fact that he fully intended to see them again. And the Whitlocks treated him like the help. They never quite learned his name, called him by 2 or 3 wrong ones across the whole expedition, and never once corrected themselves. And whenever he spoke, careful and accented and precise, they would share a little look with each other, the kind of look that says, "Isn't this quaint?" as if his caution were a charming local custom and not the single most valuable thing on the mountain. It turns my stomach that they couldn't be bothered to learn the name of the one man who could keep them breathing up there. Pemba had led clients like this before, and he had a way of working with them that did not depend on them respecting him at all. He simply did his job, watched them closely, and kept his own counsel. He knew that the things which actually mattered up high were not opinions. They were facts. The rate the oxygen burned, the speed the weather built, the hour showing on the clock. And he intended to manage every one of them, whether the Whitlocks appreciated it or not. On the afternoon of May 20th, they rested at the South Col as well as anyone can rest at that altitude, and a little before 10 that night, into a hard cold wind and a sky scattered with stars, they clipped into the fixed line and started up. It had been like that the whole way up the mountain. On the lower slopes, weeks earlier, Pemba and the other Sherpas had done the heaviest and most dangerous work of the entire expedition, ferrying loads through the icefall in the small hours when the ice is most stable, fixing and checking the ropes, building the camps, doing the quiet, invisible labor that turns a deadly mountain into something a paying client can survive. The Whitlocks had walked through all of it as though it were a hotel that had simply assembled itself around them. When Pemba had once gently slowed Tate on a steep section to fix his footing, Tate had shrugged him off and complained to the operator that his guide was treating him like a beginner. They had come to be served, and a man trying to keep them alive kept getting in the way of the experience they had paid for. The climb out of the South Col in the dark is its own strange world. Everything shrinks to the small circle of a headlamp and the boots of the person ahead. The cold finds every gap in your clothing and settles into your bones with the wind pushing it well past 40 degrees below zero, and the only sounds are the crampons biting the ice, the hiss of the oxygen, and your own breath loud inside the mask. Pemba set a pace that felt, to the Whitlocks, insultingly slow. It was not slow. It was the exact pace the math of the night demanded. The pace that would get them to the top with enough oxygen left in the bottles to also get them back down, which is the only part of any summit that has ever really mattered. I admire that his slow pace was really survival math, the exact speed that gets a body home, and they read it as weakness. Here's the thing about bottled oxygen that the Whitlocks never once bothered to understand. You do not carry enough of it to breathe freely and easily. You carry a careful, rationed amount set to a low flow and calculated to last the entire long round trip, up and back down. And the single fastest way to die high on that mountain is to burn through it before you are safely down. Pemba had set their regulators to a conservative flow and told them, as plainly as he could, to leave them exactly there. For the first couple of hours they did, but they were cold and they were working hard, and the low flow made them feel weak and slow. And somewhere on the dark slope below the balcony, out of his sight, first Tate and then Sloan reached down and quietly turned their own regulators up. It felt wonderful. The extra oxygen flooded in, the strength came back into their legs, and suddenly the careful pace felt ridiculous to them. An old man dawdling on an easy hill, and they began to push, surging ahead on the fixed line, pleased with themselves, more certain than ever that they had been right all along about how easy this really was. Strung out above and below them, on the dark slope were the headlamps of the other climbers and their Sherpas, a thin line of small lights crawling up the side of the mountain, every one of them running the same desperate clock. Up there the body is starving for oxygen, no matter what the bottle gives it. The brain is slower, the hands are clumsier, and the simplest tasks, clipping a carabiner or swapping a glove, take twice as long and twice the will. This was the environment the Whitlocks had decided they understood better than the man who had survived it 11 times. It is an environment that does not care in the slightest what you believe about yourself, where confidence and competence are two completely different things, and only one of them keeps you alive. I can't stand how good that extra oxygen must have felt, because feeling strong up there on borrowed gas is exactly the hook being set. Pemba saw it almost at once, the way they surged, the new energy that had no business existing on the flow he had set. He caught up, checked their gauges, and saw the needles sitting far lower than they should have been for that point on the route. He told them, in the plainest words he had, that they were burning their summit oxygen and their descent oxygen all at the same time, that the bottles would never stretch if they kept this up. They waved him off. They had paid for oxygen, they reminded him, and they intended to breathe it. And they did not appreciate being rationed like children on a mountain they had spent a small fortune to climb. That is the part I sit with, that he told them the actual life and death truth, in the simplest words he could find, and they heard it as a man being difficult. To them it was a customer service problem, a guide overstepping. To him it was a countdown that had already started. What stuns me is he handed them the truth, and to them it just registered as a man overstepping his place. They reached the balcony, a small shelf of snow at around 27,600 feet, just as the first gray of dawn came into the sky, and that was where Pemba began watching the weather, as closely as he watched the clock. Far to the west, out over the shoulder of the mountain, a long, smooth, lens-shaped cloud was forming and sitting on the wind, the kind of cloud that means nothing to someone who does not know what they are looking at, and means everything to someone who does. It is the signature of a rising wind, high above, the jet stream dropping its edge back down onto the peak, and it is one of the oldest warnings the mountain knows how to give. Pemba had turned around on the sight of that exact cloud before, and he was alive partly because of it. He told them they needed to think hard right now about turning around. They were behind on time, they were low on oxygen, they should still have had plenty of, and the sky was beginning to tell him the afternoon would turn violent. The summit was still more than 1,000 feet above them, hours away at their real pace, and every one of those feet would have to be paid back on the way down. He laid all of it out as clearly as a man can lay anything out, and they laughed at him. They actually laughed, the two of them, standing up there in the thin gray light, because to them, a pretty little cloud and a nervous guide were simply not a reason to walk away from the most expensive photograph of their entire lives. They told him the weather looked perfectly fine. They told him he was being dramatic, that he obviously wanted an easy day, that this was exactly the sort of overcaution they had paid extra to rise above. It wrecks me that he read the sky perfectly, said the one thing that saves them, and they answered like he was canceling dinner. Pemba was their guide, not their jailer. On a guided climb, the final decision to keep going up still belongs to the client, and a Sherpa who physically drags a paying couple off the mountain against their will does not have a job to come home to. He had said the words. He had said them more than once, as plainly as they could be said. The Whitlocks heard the words and chose the summit anyway, and so Pemba did the only thing left to him, which was to stay close and try to keep two people alive who had just overruled the one person actually qualified to make the call. They clipped on and kept climbing into a sky that was quietly turning against them. There is a thing in mountaineering that experienced climbers will tell you is harder than any physical part of the climb, and that is the discipline of turning around. The mountain is right there. You can see it. You have spent years and a fortune and every ounce of yourself to get this close, and walking away from a summit you could almost touch is the hardest decision in the entire sport. That is exactly why so many of the dead on these peaks are found above their turnaround time and not below it. Strong and capable people who simply could not make themselves stop a few hundred feet from the top. Pemba knew that trap better than anyone, and he was watching two people who had never once in their lives been told no walk straight into it. I wish the mountain had some rule that could overrule a customer, but the awful part is that up there, it really doesn't. The last stretch to the top of Everest is the most exposed ground most people will ever stand on in their lives. The route runs along a knife of a ridge, with a sheer drop of thousands of feet down one side into Tibet, and thousands more down the other into Nepal, past the south summit, across a narrow corniced traverse, and up the famous step just below the summit before the final snow slope to the top. It is slow, technical, and completely unforgiving, and the Whitlocks moved across it far more slowly than they believed they were moving, because the oxygen they had wasted was running thin now, and the altitude was dulling them in ways they could not feel from the inside. It was already past the middle of the day when they finally stood on the summit of the world, and for a few minutes, it was everything they had pictured. The whole earth fell away beneath their boots, the curve of the horizon, the brown plateau of Tibet on one side, and the green valleys of Nepal on the other, and they got their photographs, the flags, the poses, the brand moment of a lifetime captured at 29,000 feet. But the light was already wrong. The smooth cloud Pemba had spotted at dawn had grown and spread and was climbing the mountain toward them. The wind had a new edge in it that had not been there an hour before, and the warmth of standing on top was already curdling into the cold dread of a man who knew exactly how late it had gotten. They had also taken far too long to get there. The traffic on the fixed lines, the awkward, oxygen-starved fumbling at every transition, the photos they kept stopping for, all of it had eaten the morning, and they had topped out hours later than any safe schedule allows. Up high, time is not just time. It is oxygen burning and weather building and daylight bleeding away. And every minute they had spent celebrating was a minute stolen from the descent. They still had to survive. Pemba had watched the clock the whole way up with a quiet, growing dread, because he understood what the numbers meant, even when the Whitlocks could not feel them. They believed they had won. He knew they were only very far from finished. I think the saddest image in this whole story is that summit photo. Two people grinning on top of the world, already never going home. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of that mountain, the thing every experienced climber carries in their bones. The summit is not the goal, it is the halfway point, and it is the halfway point reached at your most exhausted and most depleted, with the harder, deadlier half still ahead of you, and the weather getting worse by the minute. Far more people die on Everest going down than ever die coming up, and they die for exactly the reasons that were now stacking themselves against the Whitlocks. They started down, and within minutes the mountain collapsed into white. The cloud Pemba had read at dawn swallowed the upper ridge whole, and the world that had been endless and clear from the summit became a roaring, blinding nothing, wind-driven snow erasing the route only a few feet in front of their faces. This is the exact scenario that kills people up there. The descent from the summit caught in a whiteout, when the fixed line and the boot pack are the only things tying a climber to the safe path down, and everything past them is a void falling away in every direction. It scares me how cleanly the mountain hides the danger behind the summit, because the top feels like the finish when it's barely halftime, and now the oxygen ran out. First Tate's bottle, then Sloane's. The gas they had been so eager to breathe down, finally gone, far above the safety of the coal, and there was nothing left to give them, because the high flow they had run all day had burned clean through the whole supply, the spare bottles included. Without it, at that altitude, in that cold, the change in them was fast and terrifying. Their movements went clumsy and slow. Their thinking, already dulled, started to come apart at the seams. Hypoxia at that height does not simply exhaust a person. It takes the judgment first, the starved brain turning slow and stubborn, and sometimes openly hostile, so that the very moment they most needed to listen was the moment they had become least able to. The moment the gas runs dry is the one I can't shake, because everything after it was already decided when they laughed at him. This is how the worst disasters on this mountain have almost always unfolded. Not one dramatic catastrophe, but a slow stacking of small, ordinary failures, a late start, a little too much oxygen burned too soon, a warning brushed aside until a climber is standing exhausted and blind in a storm on the most dangerous ground on earth with no margin left for a single mistake. Up there, a person does not have to do anything spectacular to die. They only have to lose the rope, or take one step in the wrong direction, or sit down to rest in a place where sitting down is the same as giving up. The Whitlocks were now doing very nearly all of it at once, and this is the cruelest knot in the whole thing, because now the Arrogance and the Altitude were pulling in the exact same direction. A humble person would still have been impaired up there, of course, but a humble person would have spent the whole climb listening, would have trusted the man beside them on pure instinct, and might well have been led down on reflex alone. The Whitlocks had spent the entire mountain training themselves to ignore him. It guts me that the one habit that saves them, just trusting Pemba, was the exact habit they'd refused to build all climb. Pemba did everything a human being can do up there. He fought his way to them in the whiteout and tried to clip them firmly back onto the fixed line, the single thread connecting them to the route down, and he tried to short rope them, to tie them directly to his own harness so he could control their descent and catch them if either one fell, which is the standard thing a guide does for a failing client on lethal ground. It is not an insult, it is the most protective act one climber can offer another, and even then, even blind and freezing and dying on their feet, some broken mix of their pride and their hypoxia made them fight him on it. Sloane wrenched herself free of the short rope, snapping that she would not be hauled around like a piece of luggage. And Tate, confused and belligerent, and barely himself anymore, reached down and unclipped his own harness from the fixed line in the middle of the whiteout, the one thing that absolutely no one is ever supposed to do up there, because he wanted to move his own way and would not be tied to anyone. Now neither of them was attached to anything at all, not the line, not the rope, not Pemba. He was already lunging for them, shouting into the wind for them to clip back in, when Tate, with Sloane only a step behind him, walked onto ground he could not see, ground that was not the road at all, and the slope he expected to be under his boot simply was not. I've read this part more times than I should, and I still can't believe he undid the one clip tying him to the living world. He fell, and the rope he had refused to be tied into was not there to catch him, and Sloane, unroped now herself and barely a step away, lunged for him on pure instinct and went off the edge with him, the two of them gone into the white in the space of a single breath. Pemba threw himself forward and got a gloved hand on a trailing strap and felt it tear straight through his fingers, and then there was nothing at all. No weight, no rope, just the wind and the snow and the empty place on the ridge where two people had been standing a heartbeat before. They fell thousands of feet down the face of the mountain, dead within seconds of shoving away the very last hand that was trying to hold on to them. Pemba Rinzin somehow brought himself down alive, frostbitten and broken, and radioed what had happened to the team below. The expedition operator notified the local authorities and the Whitlock's family, and the slow, grim work of a high-altitude death began, the part the brochures never show. Recovering a body from a fall like that, on that terrain, in the death zone, is a mission that risks the lives of the living, and on the highest mountain on Earth, it very often cannot be done at all. The mountain the Whitlocks believed they had bought a clean passage up had simply kept them. It haunts me that the man they mocked the entire way up was the only reason anyone on Earth ever learned how they died. The man they had mocked the entire climb, whose name they never once managed to say right, was the only reason anyone ever knew what happened on that ridge. He had been right about the pace, the oxygen, the cloud at dawn, the rope, every single thing they laughed at, and he stayed with them to the last second, trying to undo choices that were never his to make. They had spent a fortune and a lifetime of certainty to stand on top of the world, and the one thing that could have carried them home was the single thing their money could not buy, and their pride would not let them take: the humility to listen to the man who knew the way down.